Acoustic. I love the music. And welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, that miracle that happened, that one time. And this is Episode 39. It's a continuation of Episode 38. So you should listen to that first if you haven't already. We're continuing our Birth of Science double episode, and Charlie's Angel, who some call a data demon, is our guest. Back to Galileo. He made an interesting move which the Church reacted against. He insisted what he observed was true. Venus had phases, and it could not be questioned by anyone unless they had better math or better observations. In effect, he insisted that the Church had no right to describe physical reality. Of course, that sounds very Protestant. Most historians of science do not understand what I told you in episode 27 about the dead.
Remind me what you said about the dead?
The Catholic Church, through the ritual of the Mass, could have an effect on souls in purgatory, like white magic or a special technology. And Luther's condemnation of this claim led to a lot of trouble, to understate things a little. The Church could not afford to admit that their understanding of the universe was faulty. That would seem to weaken their claim to the magic of the Mass. In reason, I mean. This wasn't a mere matter of faith back then. In effect, Galileo was too soon. He didn't stop working, and the Church had to condemn him again in 1633. Galileo's problems, and even more Bruno's, had an effect on René Descartes. And René Descartes is our next character here. He was French, and he had to move to the Netherlands to publish. And he published a hell of a lot. He's most famous nowadays for cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And some say dubito ergo sum, I doubt, therefore I am, is a better construction. Often described as the founder of modern philosophy, and fair enough. But I think what makes him really important to this story is that along the way, he needed to take Galileo's idea that nature can be described with mathematics a step farther. So he invented analytical geometry and techniques for solving cubic equations that were helpful to Newton later. Some, though, point out that with the discourse, he proves mathematically that God exists, but from the initial point, we don't need God to explain anything. We just need math. Since then, many people have tried to rescue God in this narrow sense and failed. It's only this century that Nick Bostrom brought him back, but so far, incompletely. Theology in the past had attracted the best minds for many hundreds of years into the fascinating world of the immaterial. But now suddenly the world of the immaterial, once the most interesting thing, now ceased to be at all interesting. It was reduced to Aristotle's prime mover again. Van Doren describes this as one of the most radical changes in the history of thought. I have to agree, but let me think more on what the consequences were for the miracle specifically, because dubito. You see, Van Doren goes farther and blames the fact that we live in a desert of the spirit on Descartes. The wrong turn French postmodernism took and its various baleful descendants today, I'm a bit more inclined to say that the errors of 1930s fascism were all taken in by postmodernism nearly wholesale. And that's why we have the obsessions we have today on equity, incoherent social ideas in and out of universities, rather than blame Descartes. But that's just a leaning. I haven't come to a conclusion. Now, this whole chain of great minds leads us to Newton. People say things like he was the preeminent scientific genius of all time. And it's okay. When you hear things like that about Newton, don't splutter and say, but Einstein. People don't mean to say they can establish one person or the other as the top guy. It's not an argument. It just means he was very, very important to the history of science. Ordinary people can be sloppy with their words.
That's obvious, though. Why state it? You've been sloppy with your words, even in this episode.
Well, there are some really smart people listening who take things too literally, are aware of it, and are trying to cope with what normies think is normal.
There's that pet theory of yours that some people on the autism spectrum have more to contribute than normal people.
Yes, there it is again. Newton was one of those rather obvious geniuses. When he graduated, he was basically made the head of the mathematics department at Cambridge. His predecessor, Isaac Barrow, offered to resign to allow this to happen. I mention Isaac Barrow because he has to be one of history's greatest souls. His big undergrad accomplishment was discovering the binomial theorem. And then there was a plague. In 1666, a plague devastated London. Not like our 2020 plague, which kills 1% or so of the people who catch it, the elderly mainly. But this one killed almost a quarter of the population of London. Imagine 1 in 4 or 5 people everywhere you go just suddenly falling down dead. The mind boggles. But back then, people were not as mobile, so plagues didn't move as fast, and they didn't spread everywhere. So when the plague came to Cambridge, young Isaac Newton left for a family farm in Lincolnshire and waited for the plague to burn itself out. And there he discovered and invented a lot of things that we're going to discuss in a minute. But it was possibly the plague that gave him time and freedom from distraction to work. Optimistic people will sometimes express a hope that some similar great achievements are being laid down during our 2020 lockdown. That's me too, about 5 days a week. Other days, like today, are darker. In the farmhouse, Newton did a lot of work on optics, the nature of light. But the main thing he did there was found a new physics that would be the foundation for all modern science. And I will note that he did not publish all this until 1687 in the Principia, in Latin, by the way. And with dates like 1666 and 1687, you may fear we've run far ahead of the historical narrative. Fear not, we are going back.
So, during that plague year, Newton already knew a lot of things. Newton knew that Gilbert had had the idea that the Earth had an attractive force like a magnet. He knew Galileo had seen the moons of Jupiter and studied falling bodies. Descartes had shown how to apply mathematical models to physical problems. Kepler described the elliptical paths of the planets and wondered if a strange force emanated from the sun to control the planets. And Buridan had challenged Aristotle's notion of inertia.
But there were many thousands of people who knew all this at the time. There was only one who thought, well, if only there were a kind of mathematics that could explain the phenomenon of a universe in constant motion, we could get real answers. So he invented differential calculus and integral calculus. Van Doren suggests no other single gift to science has been more valued. He came up with the 3 laws of motion. Everyone's favorite is the third. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And with these laws of motion and the description of gravity, he solved the greatest problem in science at the time, the problem of how the universe worked. Jaws dropped all over the world in amazement. And let's let Pope's famous couplet stand in for the world's reaction. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. Aristotle's physics, not his logic, but his physics, with its notion of natural inertia, were exploded forever. I mean, we're still looking at the universe and asking, what the hell is this thing? Does it have 26 dimensions? Why is almost all the matter and energy dark? It's all 8-dimensional geometric forms rotating and interacting? And why do muons, which no one ever ordered, keep destroying qubits in quantum computers? It's like the universe resists being solved. Now, there's a conspiracy theory there. The simulators might not want us to understand the universe that well, so they don't want us to do quantum computing. And so they invented muons, which no one really needs for anything, and muons keep destroying qubits. It's like the universe actively resists being solved. But back to Newton. He also created the core of the scientific method, which is still followed today with his 4 rules of reasoning in science and his notion of epistemic humility. And this is certainly important enough to read out fully. 1. We are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are true and sufficient to explain the appearances. And so here appearances refers to experience, and this is basically Occam and Wycliffe restated. 2. To the same natural effects we must assign the same causes. 3. The qualities of things in our experiences are the qualities of things everywhere. Man, that's a really interesting idea. And people aren't sure that it's really true. Like Werner Vinge's Fire in the Deep series. But we have to assume it's true. 4. We are to look upon propositions inferred by general induction from phenomena as accurate or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypotheses that may be imagined, till such time as other phenomena occur, by which they may either be made more accurate or liable to exceptions. By adding epistemic humility, he says we cannot just dream up explanations for things. We have to be willing to admit what we do not know. Explanations not directly supported by experiment are not science. The branches of science that hew to these rules have done well and progressed a great deal. The rest are stuck in a replication crisis or even worse, which has been noted but not improved upon. The people who study studies determine that 85% or so should never exist, are so bad they are worse than useless. And yet we glide forward on the other 15%. We hope. And we have pranksters that get completely made-up studies to pass peer review into prestigious journals, so at least we have memes available to resist the nonsense.
If only there was a journal of replication.
One of our main lessons in this thread, from one great scientist to another, is fear and censorship. Copernicus was terrified. Galileo was amazingly brave. He wanted to replace the authority of the church with a new authority, science. Galileo did something utterly fascinating when he insisted that he brought the truth to the pontifical court. And this revealed the weak, really helpless position of the church, because the church could not create reality, because Galileo was right, simply right. Descartes was not as brave, but his move to the Netherlands enabled him to publish freely. Science could only fully flourish without censorship and fear. As we will see, this is going to be true in politics and economics as well. Even in England, speaking out against royal rule was treason and a death penalty offense. So you can't say, this monarchy thing, it's a bad idea, if saying it will cost you your head. So perhaps it becomes very hard to even think it. The execution of people like Bruno, who called Elizabeth Estrella, may have been technically for heresy, denying Christ's divinity, but a scientist will come up with weird ideas, and that's what we want them to do. Judicial burning for saying the wrong thing inhibited development in the very place where the miracle should have been born, Renaissance Italy. When you visit Rome and see the statue of Bruno at the Campo dei Fiori, it's a beautiful setting that's very evocative, and you may have confused feelings. On the one hand, you have a statue that captures an anti-clerical hostility, followed by a feeling that the church is a great institution that doesn't deserve all the hate it gets. But then you have to be relieved that we don't allow them to burn people anymore. And by the way, Bellarmine, remember him? Saint Bellarmine was also Bruno's prosecutor. Bruno didn't just get house arrest, he was hung upside down and burned to death. John Milton traveled to Italy in the 1630s and was well received at the University of Padua despite his Calvinist leanings. But Padua was under the protection of Venice and not subject to the Inquisition. There, his conversations with artists and writers convinced him that the great Italian artists and writers could not tell the truth. Therefore, they had to play a different game. He would be aware of how Laudian censorship was different from living under the Inquisition, but the Laudian censorship was getting worse, as we will cover. But I do want to talk about the excitement the new discoveries were creating. Intelligent young men were in demand for their intelligence, probably for the first time in centuries for something other than employment in the trade union called clergy. Harriet in England seemed to have the whole world at his feet. Exploration, creating tables of logarithms for navigators, cataloging nature, telling Kepler what he needed to understand about optics and refraction, making the first map of the moon. Imagine. The technology so new, everything would be first. The whole scientific enterprise understood for the first time. One of my favorite little vignettes comes via David Wooten's Invention of Science. A newly appointed mathematics professor at Pisa, a pupil of Galileo, complained that, quote, "Of all the millions of things there are to discover, I don't discover a single one." As a consequence, he lived in endless torment, unquote. Since time began, there have been impatient young men, anxious that they might fail to live up to their own expectations. Well, Niccolò Agunti may have been the first to worry that he would never make a significant discovery. And another favorite is Jacques Cartier, saying that the simple sailors of today have learned the opposite of the opinion of philosophers by true experience. So here we are. Opinion is being overthrown to be replaced by experience. Experience is discovering new things and truths, which is energizing the young. Experience is teaching, not just new things, but revealing that many ancient truths were merely opinion. And then I've been mentioning Francis Bacon as foreshadowing the scientific revolution. His Novo Organon, which means the new tool. And there's a reference back to episode 10 about mental, emotional, and spiritual toolboxes. His argument was that the scholastic learning taught at universities were sterile and empty and could not lead to new discoveries. Their insistence on old intellectual proofs, arguments from authority and certainty, were a dead end. There needed to be an open, inquiring spirit. Wow. Sounds like we need a new Francis Bacon today. Bacon pointed out that the new discoveries, gunpowder, printing, the compass, the New World, had been generated in a haphazard way. He said that the way forward was to deliberately seek discoveries. The separation he saw in society between soft-handed, intellectual, university-trained gentlemen and hard-handed craftsmen would have to end. Gentlemen and craftsmen would have to become each other. Book learning and workshop experience would have to be joined to generate new knowledge. He is most famous for saying, "Human knowledge and power come to the same thing," i.e., knowledge is power. It would take a couple of decades, but after 1640, he was held up as an ideal by the new scientists that would eventually form the Royal Society in 1660. I know several listeners are in the life sciences, and this process of discovery helped separate life sciences into its own realm. Before this, animals and plants were tied into a symbolic web of associations. Regal lions, proud peacocks, the cunning fox, the laurel of victory. People were not thinking scientifically. But then we discovered potatoes, and possums, and anteaters, and natural history began to carve out space for itself as a science. The printing process was a vital part of it all, publicizing discoveries and allowing the creation of wider communities than could be supported by letter writing. A key idea about scientific knowledge is that it is public knowledge. Get that? Privately held knowledge or unshared discoveries might just as well not count. An example is that many people think fishermen of the Outer Banks must have been aware of Newfoundland, but they kept it secret. So it didn't benefit anyone but fishermen. Priority disputes, who did it first, therefore became an indicator for historians of a discipline becoming scientific and oriented towards discovery. Which is really interesting because I used to think of priority disputes as stupid social monkey stuff. But actually, I've learned that it is stupid social monkey stuff that is a great indicator and a big improvement on fighting wars to become famous. Progress. I'm going to repeat something from part 1. It used to be that if you sought immortality, you would need to gather an army and make conquests. Now, making a scientific or geographic discovery was a surer path. There's a logic in the process of discovery that did not translate well outside Europe for some reason. And after Copernicus was condemned, discovery was visibly slower in Catholic countries, though never killed off. Wherever this new version of the idea of discovery in science met resistance, as in the Ottoman Empire and China as examples, there was no takeoff. If you're an absolute ruler like a sultan, science was easy to stop completely. But you could not stop it happening in places where you had no control. So we see some societies that were previously the most advanced start to fall behind. They would be the victims in a political sense. In a political sense, the Europeans would soon be able to boss them around. Nowadays, this is often condemned in moral terms. But really, what do you expect? Monkeys will monkey. But generally, human societies were not willing to embrace radical change, and science was radical change. The Protestants, however, would soon be fighting for their lives and embracing radical change in order to survive. The world leaders, the Dutch, had embraced radical social change and were therefore getting more from their people than any other country. Under the pressure of civil war, England would go even farther. Science was about to rocket forward. And thanks, Charlie's Angel. I really appreciate your contributions and challenges. Next week, we go back to historical narrative and James I after Conversations with Cami.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
We're sitting outside on a really nice December day, very sunny, dogs barking in the background, birds tweeting. Cammy's here smiling. What do you have to say about episode 39?
Charlie's Angel caught you bringing up the topic of the autistic spectrum. You suggested perhaps Newton was on that spectrum. Do we have any direct evidence?
I didn't really mean for the suggestion to be that obvious. I thought it would be more subtle. You just caught it right away. We don't have direct evidence. Some of Newton's biographers, though, do think he had a lot of autistic tendencies. But it was, 350 years ago. It's hard to put our categories on people back then.
Yeah, it was before we even probably had those terms.
It totally was, yeah.
So I was just curious cool to go back in time and meet him.
Yeah, interestingly, they eventually made him, in his old age, master of the mint in the early 18th century.
Master of the mint.
Yeah, so he was in charge of the coinage of the realm.
Well, so he was definitely a detail guy.
Yeah, but also, I don't know, maybe that shows something about English priorities. We take the best mind we've got and put him in charge of the money.
Hey, I don't disagree with that sometimes. Better than putting the story and going into how he left for the countryside during the plague and had the opportunity, perhaps that he might not have had the quiet.
Yeah,
fewer
the demands
put into his studies was information that was interesting to me. I really liked the phrase, the universe resists being solved. Somehow thinking of that makes me feel a little bit better for being an average person and not having all the answers there are in life. I think we need to remind ourselves of that more often.
Yeah. If you know you don't have the answers, then you're probably ahead of almost everyone who thinks they have the answers.
True, but somehow when we don't have the answers, we don't think highly of ourselves. My observation. It's nice to hear a willingness to admit that we do not know coming from great minds. So, in the time, science being unable to flourish due to penalty and fear.
Well, there were just so many places where there were so many obstacles. Medieval China had their very strenuous examination process, and people didn't have the capacity to learn more than they had to learn to take the civil service exams.
But the thought about science only being able to flourish if you don't have penalty and fear, it makes me appreciate that much more our freedoms of speech that we have here. The ability, even if they're wrong, people have the ability to state those new ideas and opinions so that they can be looked at.
Absolutely.
Flourish and go forward.
I mean, I think Milton put it best when he said something, I'm going to have to paraphrase from memory, but we do truth and injustice when we misdoubt her strength and fear to let her contest with falsehood.
Somehow I get a feeling I would have liked bacon. I don't mean the food that you so love. His way of thinking and integrating the book learning with the experience to give people a more rounded way of discovering things and learning new things and integrating the two probably very different camps at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Invention and engineering is vital and can discover truths that theoretical research can't uncover. Things work. And then you have to stop and ask the question, well, why does this work? Why does this happen? And then you can develop a theoretical knowledge on a much firmer foundation, which can feed back into, further inventions, further discoveries. It's a virtuous cycle.
Well, my thought about Bacon was, without someone thinking in terms out of the box, it's really thinking out of the box at the time of, hey, we need to integrate these two very different types of learning into one that would help advance things that much quicker.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree that worked and is still working.
Some countries and the leaders in the population were willing to embrace radical change, but others were not. Can you give me a couple of examples of that?
Well, there's a book by Joseph Henrich, The Weirdest People in the World, where he describes how Western Europeans were really unusual in the world at that time, for the levels of social trust that they had, for personal traits that were different. But even within Western Europe, accepting radical social change was quite difficult, and it was often pushed from the top down. In France, when Louis XIII and Louis XIV began to take complete control over the country and push their administration out into the provinces, they began to look for ways to improve their country, to make it richer and stronger in a conscious, deliberate sort of way. Countries like the United Provinces were under severe pressure from the natural environment, learning how to manage water, and from having and being in an existential war with Spain. Their social advances were accomplished by having civil wars inside of their struggle against Spain. And with that struggle, people began to develop a strong sense of trust with one another, and institutions like insurance and banking could be developed, which was impossible under any other kind of circumstance. And then in England, during the Civil War, there are a lot of ways to state this. The one that's coming to mind is that the parliamentary side, their reserve was the people, and the radicals among the people, and they wanted social change. They wanted a great deal more equality. And those people rose up through the ranks in the new model army and were part of the military dictatorship that happened after the Civil War. And actually, the country was ruled on a social basis of independent Puritans, people who believed that you didn't have to have an official church of any kind, and people who were against any kind of church discipline, people who were against even the concept of lords and nobility, people who were against the concept of monarchy. And for a time, they triumphed, and that changed a lot of the underlying social structure in England compared to the rest of Europe.
Wow, that sounds like a really dynamic time that must have been.
It was, and it was quite successful. One of the things that happened during the Cromwellian period was that they had several years of really excellent harvests, and that helped the country be a lot more stable. There was a lot less rioting. There was a lot less social unrest. People were generally happier and more content. And so even though it seemed like a really narrow social basis upon which to have a government that didn't have a lot of apparatus of control, it really worked very well for a number of years. Okay, Cami, thanks for coming on the episode.
You're welcome. I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Please click subscribe or follow on your podcast app. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend about it. If you don't, please tell an enemy. If you're on Twitter X, go find me and give me a follow. Thank you for listening.